On Christmas Eve, Harold Matthews packs up his desk at Richmond Industries. After 40 years of loyal service, he's been fired. The security guard's pitying look follows him out into the cold. At 68, finding a new job seems impossible, but Harold refuses to let despair win. Back home, he does what he's done every evening for the past 3 months, prepares a hot meal for Michael, the quiet, homeless man who sits outside his house. Harold's own dinner can wait. He doesn't know it, but Michael has been watching him closely. Because Michael isn't really homeless, he's Robert McAllister, the secretive owner of Richmond Industries. What will happen when Harold discovers the truth about the man he's been feeding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Back in his modest 2-bedroom home, Harold sat in his favorite armchair, a weathered leather photo album spread across his lap. The evening light filtering through lace curtains, Mary's curtains, cast gentle shadows across photographs spanning 4 decades at Richmond Industries. His trembling fingers traced the edge of a faded Polaroid from 1983. There he stood, 28 years old, bright-eyed and nervous on his first day. Mary had insisted on taking the picture, straightening his tie one last time before he left. For orientation, "You'll want to remember this day," she'd said. She was right, as she so often was. The next page showed his first office Christmas party. Harold smiled despite himself, remembering how department head Thompson had too much punch and started singing carols off-key. In the photo, Harold stood near the punch bowl, already displaying what would become his signature pose. Slightly, too. The side, ready to help if needed, never seeking the spotlight. A group shot from '89 caught his eye, the year Richmond Industries landed the Peterson account. Harold had spent countless late nights reconciling the numbers, making sure every detail was perfect. The CEO back then, Robert McAllister Sr., had personally thanked him for his dedication. "People like you, Matthews," he'd said, "are the backbone of this company." His fingers lingered on a photo from Mary's last Christmas party at Richmond, 2015. Even then, fighting cancer, she'd insisted on attending. "Your work family matters too," she'd said. The office had rallied around them that year, organizing meal trains, covering Harold's shifts when he needed to take her to appointments. In the photo, Mary's smile remained radiant despite her illness. Her hand clasped firmly in Harold's. The last few pages held more recent memories, his 40th anniversary celebration just 6 months ago, where he'd received that golden watch, now sitting heavy in his desk drawer. The current CEO, Robert Jr., hadn't attended, but HR had sent a lovely card with a stamped signature. Harold closed the album gently, dust motes dancing in the fading light. 40 years of dedication, of arriving early and staying late, of teaching. New hires and covering for colleagues during family emergencies. 40 years of being the steady hand, the reliable one, the go-to person for crisis management. All ended with a 15-minute meeting and a standard severance package. The grandfather clock in the hallway, another of Mary's treasures, chimed 5 times. Almost time for Michael's dinner. Harold stood, joints protesting slightly, and made his way to the kitchen. The photo album found its place back on the shelf, next to Mary's favorite novels and their wedding album. As he began preparing the evening meal, his mind wandered to the younger employees he'd left behind. Linda in accounting, just starting. Her family. James in data entry, caring for his elderly mother. Tom in maintenance, putting his kids through college. He'd tried to teach them what he'd learned over the years, that a company was more than balance sheets and bottom lines. It was people, relationships, small kindnesses that added up to something greater than themselves. The sound of pots and pans filled the kitchen as Harold fell into his familiar routine. Perhaps that's what hurt the most, not the loss of income, though that would hit hard soon enough, but the loss of purpose, of daily connections, of being part of something larger than himself. Steam rose from the pot of soup he was preparing, Mary's recipe, the one that had gotten them through countless cold winters. She'd always made extra, saying you never knew who might need a warm meal and a kind word. Harold smiled softly, realizing he was still following her example even now. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, adding to the blanket of white covering his small front yard. Through the kitchen window, he could see Michael's familiar figure huddled in his usual spot, near the front gate. The man's dedication to his chosen post rivaled Harold's own former dedication to Richmond Industries. "Well, Mary," Harold whispered to the quiet kitchen, "at least I can still do this one small thing right." He reached for a thermos, ready to serve another meal to the quiet stranger who had become an unexpected constant in his newly uncertain life. 24 hours earlier, Harold had arrived at Richmond Industries just as he had every morning for the past 40 years. The sky was still dark, streetlights reflecting off fresh snow as he used his keycard to enter the building. In his briefcase, last year's Christmas bonus check stub sat in a small folder, a reminder of better times that he'd meant to file away months ago. The lobby was quiet, holiday decorations twinkling in the pre-dawn darkness. Harold nodded to Carl, the night security guard finishing his shift. "Merry Christmas Eve, Mr. Matthews," Carl called out. "You're early as always." "Merry Christmas, Carl. How's Amy doing with college applications?" "Got accepted to 3 schools already. Thanks for those tips about financial aid forms." Harold smiled, remembering how he'd helped Carl navigate the complicated paperwork over lunch breaks. These small interactions, these threads of connection, they were the real fabric of corporate life, though few in management seemed to understand that anymore. The elevator hummed as it carried him to the 4th floor. The accounting department was dark and empty, but Harold liked it this way. Early mornings were his time to prepare, to ensure everything was in order before the day began. As he settled at his desk, something felt different. The annual holiday memo hadn't arrived in his inbox, unusual for December 24th. The last few years, it had always contained news about bonuses, the company party, and charity initiatives. Harold brushed off his concern, focusing instead on reviewing year-end reports. Around 8 o'clock, others began filtering in. Linda, from 2 desks over, arrived with her usual coffee and bagel. "Morning, Harold. Did you see the email about the emergency department meeting at 10? Harold frowned, checking his inbox again. "No email yet." "Oh." Linda's cheerful expression faltered slightly. "Well, I'm sure it's nothing. Probably just last-minute holiday announcements." But there was something in her tone that made Harold uneasy. He noticed how she avoided eye contact, busying herself with her computer screen. Down the hall, he could hear whispered conversations, catching fragments about corporate restructuring and efficiency consultants. James from data entry stopped by around 9, asking Harold's advice about a complicated spreadsheet. As they talked, Harold noticed more huddles of worried conversation, more furtive glances. The holiday atmosphere that usually permeated Christmas Eve was notably absent. At 9:45, the email finally arrived, not from his direct supervisor, but from Human Resources. "Mandatory department meeting 10 a.m. conference room B. No other details, no holiday greeting, none of the usual warmth that marked internal communications." Harold sat back in his chair, his hand automatically going to his breast pocket, where he kept the small photo of Mary. He'd developed this habit during her illness, drawing strength from her presence. Now, he found himself doing it again, sensing the ground shifting beneath his feet. The golden watch on his wrist, a recognition gift received just months ago for 40 years of service, suddenly felt heavy. He remembered the ceremony, smaller than previous years' celebrations. The new management team had been conspicuously absent, sending a junior HR representative instead. As his colleagues began moving toward conference room B, Harold noticed Linda wiping her eyes quickly, trying to hide it. James was shoving papers into his desk drawer with unusual force. Tom from maintenance walked past, his usually cheerful face set in grim lines. "Coming, Harold," someone called. He stood slowly, straightening his tie. Another habit Mary had, instilled in him. "Always face uncertainty looking your best," she used to say. The familiar ache of missing her rose in his chest, stronger now in this moment of unease. The hallway to conference room B had never seemed longer. Holiday decorations lined the walls. Paper snowflakes made by employees' children, strings of tinsel, a small artificial tree. 40 Christmas seasons at Richmond Industries, each marked by these same corridors, dressed in festive cheer. But today, the decorations seemed to mock the heavy atmosphere. As Harold took his seat in the conference room, he couldn't help but think of another Christmas Eve years ago, when Robert McAllister Sr. had stood in this very room, announcing record profits and generous bonuses. "A company is only as good as its people," the elder McAllister had declared. Harold wondered what had happened to that philosophy under the new leadership. The door closed with a final-sounding click as the HR team filed in, their faces professionally neutral, carrying stacks of identical manila envelopes. The golden watch on Harold's wrist ticked quietly as Jessica Parker from HR opened the first manila envelope. Her voice, trained to maintain professional detachment, filled the silent conference room. "As part of Richmond Industries' ongoing organizational optimization, we're implementing immediate structural changes across all departments." She paused, her rehearsed speech momentarily faltering as she met Harold's steady gaze. "Certain positions have been identified as redundant." Harold sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table. The watch, presented just 6 months ago at his 40th anniversary celebration, caught the fluorescent light. He remembered the inscription on its back. "In recognition of 40 years of dedicated service." "Mr. Matthews," Jessica continued, "your position has been selected for elimination, effective immediately. Your severance package—" "I see." Harold's quiet interruption seemed to startle her. "May I ask why?" A younger HR representative shuffled through some papers. "Our efficiency consultants identified several legacy positions that could be automated or consolidated. Given your age and salary level, I understand." Harold's tone remained gentle, though his fingers tightened slightly. "Around the watch. Will there be time to hand over my ongoing projects? Linda's still learning the Peterson account protocols, and James might need guidance on the year-end reconciliation." Jessica looked uncomfortable. "Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. We've already arranged for your duties to be redistributed." Around the conference table, Harold's colleagues sat in stunned silence. Linda was openly crying now. James stared at his hands, knuckles white. Tom had stood up and walked to the window, his back to the room. Harold took a deep breath, channeling Mary's grace in difficult moments. "Very well. I assume everything's explained in here." He reached for the manila envelope. "Yes, your severance, benefits continuation, and exit procedures are all outlined. If you'll just sign, would you mind if I reviewed it at my desk first? One last time at my desk?" Something in Harold's voice made Jessica pause, her professional mask slipping slightly. "Of course, Mr. Matthews, take your time. They'll be available when you're ready." Harold stood, straightening his tie. The watch seemed to grow heavier with each movement. "Thank you for handling this professionally, Jessica. I remember when you first started in HR 5 years ago. You've come a long way from helping me organize the holiday food drive." Her composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Matthews, It's all right," he said softly. "We all have our duties." The walk back to his desk felt surreal. 40 years of memories lined the hallway, photos from company picnics, plaques celebrating team achievements, the wall where they measured heights of employees' children each Christmas. His own daughter's mark was still there, faded but visible. Sarah Matthews, 1992. At his desk, Harold sat down one last time. The manila envelope remained unopened, as he looked around at the small kingdom he'd built over 4 decades. Family, photos, carefully organized files, the plant Mary had given him 15 years ago, still thriving thanks to Linda's care during his absence after Mary's passing. He opened his drawer and removed a stack of sealed envelopes, birthday cards for the maintenance staff's children, already prepared for the coming year. A folder of training materials he'd developed for new hires, his spare reading glasses that Tom's daughter had fixed when the arm came loose. The security guard, young Kevin, whose sister Harold had helped get an internship last summer, stood awkwardly nearby. "Take your time, Mr. Matthews. No rush," Harold nodded, continuing his methodical packing. Each item carried a story, a connection, a piece of the tapestry he'd woven over 40 years. The golden watch kept time, marking the end of an era with each tick. Finally, only the plant remained. Harold turned to Linda's desk. "Would you take care of her? Mary would have liked that." Linda nodded through her tears, unable to speak. The cardboard box wasn't very full, physical manifestations of 40 years fitting easily in such a small space. Harold stood, straightening his desk one last time. "Ready, Mr. Matthews?" Kevin asked softly. "Just one moment." Harold removed the watch, looking at its gleaming surface one last time. Carefully, he placed it in the center of his desk, its face reflecting the Christmas lights strung around the office. "A parting gift," he said quietly, "for whoever comes. Next, they should know about the legacy they're inheriting." As Kevin led him toward the elevator, Harold's colleagues stood in silent tribute. No words were spoken, none were needed. 40 years of small kindnesses, quiet leadership, and unwavering dedication spoke volumes in the silence. The last thing Harold saw as the elevator doors closed was his golden watch, keeping time on an empty desk, marking the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Harold stood at the bus stop, his monthly pass held loosely in his gloved hand. The familiar Route 47 bus shelter, where he'd waited every workday for decades, suddenly felt foreign. Snow was falling harder now, collecting on his shoulders and the cardboard box at his feet. "Last bus before Christmas," the driver called out as the vehicle approached. Harold recognized him. Stan, who'd been driving this route for nearly 20 years. They'd shared countless morning greetings, weather observations, and brief updates about their families. "Everything all right, Mr. Matthews?" Stan asked, as Harold struggled with his box. "You're headed home mighty early for Christmas Eve." Harold managed a small smile. "Change of schedule, Stan. Merry Christmas." The bus was nearly empty, just a few last-minute shoppers and another office worker dozing in the back. Harold sat in his usual spot, the box balanced on his lap. Through the foggy window, he watched Richmond Industries disappear behind the curtain of snow. Memories flooded unbidden. Countless morning commutes with Mary beside him, sharing the newspaper, and quiet conversations about their dreams. The time Sarah had insisted on riding to work with him on Take Your Daughter to Work Day, proudly wearing a miniature version of his tie. The day he'd returned to work after Mary's funeral, when Stan had simply nodded and turned up the heat, understanding Harold's need for silence. His stop approached, the corner of Maple and Fifth, where the local diner's Christmas lights blinked cheerfully through the growing darkness. Harold pulled the cord, the familiar ding now seeming like a final bell tolling. "See you Monday, Mr. Matthews," Stan called out habitually, then caught himself. "I mean, Merry Christmas." Harold descended carefully, mindful of the slippery steps. The box felt heavier now, weighted with more than just physical possessions. As Stan drove away, Harold realized this was the last time he'd use this monthly bus pass, the last artifact of his daily routine. The walk home was 3 blocks, past the shops and houses he'd known for years. Old Mr. Peterson was struggling to hang last-minute Christmas lights, his ladder wobbling dangerously. Any other day, Harold would have stopped to help. Today, he barely had the strength to nod. The baker's wife waved from her shop window, holding up a fresh loaf, his usual Thursday purchase. Harold shook his head apologetically, patting his pocket where his wallet usually held exact change for bread and a cookie. Small routines, all ending. The snow muffled his footsteps as he turned onto his street. The modest houses were decorated. For Christmas, warm light spilling from windows onto the growing dusk. His own home stood dark, no lights this year. He hadn't had the heart to decorate after the property tax notice arrived, demanding funds he'd planned to use for holiday cheer. As he approached his gate, Harold noticed a familiar figure huddled in the shadows. Michael, the quiet, homeless man who'd appeared 3 months ago, sat in his usual spot, wrapped in layers of worn clothing. Their eyes met briefly before Michael looked away, maintaining the respectful distance that had characterized their silent arrangement. Harold paused, shifting the box to his other arm. Any other day he'd be preparing dinner now, setting aside a portion for his quiet guest. The thought struck him suddenly. Would he still be able to afford this small kindness? His severance package sat unopened in the box, its contents yet to reveal the scope of his new limitations. But looking at Michael, Harold felt something steady inside him. This at least he could still do. This one small routine could remain. Mary would have insisted on it, especially today. "I'll be out with dinner shortly," he said softly, more to himself than to Michael. The other man didn't respond. He never, and did, but Harold thought he saw a slight nod. At his front door, Harold fumbled with his keys, the box awkward in his arms. The house felt emptier than usual, though nothing had changed since morning. He set the box down on the hall table, next to the framed photo of Mary in her garden. Her smile seemed especially warm today, as if she knew he needed it. The bus pass slipped from his pocket as he removed his coat, landing face up on the table. One last ride home on Route 47. One final chapter closed. Through the window he could see Michael's silhouette against the falling snow, a silent sentinel marking the beginning of whatever came next. In the kitchen, Harold opened the worn recipe book, its pages stained with decades of use. Mary's handwriting filled the margins, little notes about substitutions, serving suggestions, and memories of meals shared. He turned to the soup section, where a simple note in her familiar script read, "Remember, soup is love made warm." 3 months ago, he'd found this recipe when he first noticed Michael outside his gate. It had been an unusually cold September evening, and something about the man's dignified silence had reminded Harold of himself. The memory surfaced as he began chopping vegetables, each knife stroke precise and practiced. That first evening, he'd been reviewing the property tax notice, trying to make the numbers work on his fixed income. Through the window, he'd spotted Michael sitting straight-backed despite the cold. No sign of begging or distress, just quiet endurance. Harold had opened Mary's recipe book then, seeking comfort in its familiar pages. It had fallen open to her vegetable soup recipe, the one she'd always made extra of, just in case someone needs warming up, as she used to say. "What would you do, Mary?" he'd whispered to the empty kitchen. The answer had come immediately in. Her voice, "You know exactly what I'd do, Harold Matthews." Now, as he prepared the same soup again, Harold smiled at how that first interaction had unfolded. He'd approached Michael cautiously, thermos in hand, expecting reluctance or suspicion. Instead, he'd received a quiet nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and dignity. No words had been exchanged that first night, nor many nights since. Just a simple routine. Harold would bring out a thermos of hot soup, sometimes with bread, and Michael would accept it with that same dignified nod. Occasionally their eyes would meet, and Harold would recognize something in them, a depth of understanding, a shared appreciation for the comfort of reliable kindness. The recipe book held other memories too. Harold's fingers traced a splatter mark on the page, from Sarah's first attempt at helping in the kitchen, age 6, enthusiastically stirring the soup until it sloshed over the pot's rim. Mary had laughed, saying the mess was worth the memory. "Always make extra," Mary had written beneath the recipe. "You never know who might need feeding, body or soul." As he stirred the simmering pot, Harold reflected on how this small act of feeding Michael had become an anchor in his own life. Even as other certainties fell away, his job, his financial security, his sense of purpose, this evening ritual remained. The kitchen filled with the familiar aroma of vegetables and herbs, the steam fogging the window that looked out onto his snow-covered yard. Through the condensation, he could see Michael's silhouette, still and patient in the gathering dark. Harold added the final seasonings, tasting carefully. Mary's recipe specified enough pepper to warm the heart. His movements were automatic now, born of years watching Mary cook and months of his own evening routine. The thermos stood ready on the counter, the one Mary had bought him for long days at the office, now repurposed for this new mission. Looking through the recipe book while the soup finished cooking, Harold found other notes that seemed especially poignant today. "Food made with love feeds more than the stomach," Mary had written on one page, and on another, "In hard times, sharing what we have multiplies what we receive." He thought about his uncertain future, the manila envelope still unopened in his cardboard box. The practical part of him suggested that perhaps he should be more cautious now, more reserved with his resources. But Mary's voice in his head was clear. "Kindness isn't a luxury, Harold. It's a necessity for the giver as much as the receiver." The soup was ready. Harold filled the thermos carefully, its metal surface warming his hands. Through the window, the snow continued to fall, but Michael remained in his spot, a steady presence in an unsteady world. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this moment, this simple act of human connection, felt right. "Well, Mary," he whispered to the quiet kitchen, "let's feed another soul tonight." Robert McAllister's corporate ID badge lay hidden in the inner pocket of his weathered coat, its weight a constant reminder of his true identity. From his position near Harold's gate, he could see the warm light from the kitchen window, smell the soup being prepared within, such a contrast to the sterile corporate break room he'd last visited 3 months ago, the day he'd decided to understand his company from the ground up. The decision hadn't come easily. Sitting in his top floor office that September morning, he'd been reviewing the latest efficiency reports when a name caught his eye. Harold Matthews. The consultants had flagged the position for elimination, too expensive, too traditional, resistant to modernization. Something about that assessment had struck a chord. Robert remembered his father speaking of Matthews with respect. Rare. Praise from the notoriously demanding Richmond Industries founder. "That man," his father had said, "understands what business is really about." The ID badge had been the last thing Robert touched before beginning his experiment. He'd locked it in his desk, alongside his expensive watch and the trappings of corporate power. The security team had been sworn to secrecy. Only his executive assistant knew where he really was during his supposed strategic planning retreat. Those first days on the street had been a shock. Robert had expected to observe the company from the outside, to see how employees behaved when they thought no one was watching. Instead, he found himself learning about the invisible web of relationships that held Richmond Industries together. He watched Harold arrive early each morning, greeting every security guard by name. He saw how other employees sought him out, not just for work issues, but for personal advice, a kind word, a moment of understanding. Through the lobby windows, Robert observed a corporate culture his efficiency reports had never captured. Then came the evening Harold first noticed him. Robert had chosen this spot carefully, close enough to observe, but not so close as to intrude. He'd expected to be ignored or shooed away. Instead, Harold had emerged with hot soup and quiet dignity, offering sustenance without demanding gratitude. That simple act had shifted something in Robert's perspective. Night after night, he watched Harold maintain this ritual of kindness, even as autumn chill turned to winter cold. No fanfare, no recognition sought, just the steady flame of human decency. Through his executive assistant, Robert had begun quietly investigating Harold's personnel file. 40 years of exemplary service, countless commendations. A pattern of mentoring new employees, organizing holiday charity drives, maintaining the human touch in an increasingly automated workplace. The employee satisfaction surveys told another story the efficiency reports had missed. Departments under Harold's influence showed higher retention rates, better collaboration, stronger community engagement. His old-fashioned methods of personal connection translated into measurable benefits the consultants had overlooked. Robert shifted position, slightly, easing muscles stiff from sitting in the cold. His expensive wool coat, carefully distressed to maintain his cover, did little to ward off the Christmas Eve chill. But leaving now was unthinkable. Today's events demanded witness. The termination notice had arrived on his desk last week. Robert had signed it, maintaining his cover, knowing he had to understand the full impact of corporate policies he'd rubber-stamped for years. Watching Harold pack up his desk, seeing the ripple effect through the office, it was a harsh education in the real cost of efficiency. Now, as evening settled over the snow-covered street, Robert waited. Would Harold's kindness survive this blow? Would the ritual of soup and silent dignity continue, even in the face of personal crisis? Through the fogged window he could see Harold moving in his kitchen, the familiar routine unchanged. Robert's hand moved to his inner pocket, touching the corporate ID that could end this charade instantly. But not yet. First, he needed to understand, truly understand, what his company was losing in the name of progress. The kitchen door opened, spilling warm light onto the snowy path. Harold emerged, thermos in hand, his own troubles set aside in service of helping another. Robert settled deeper into his role as Michael, accepting what was offered while silently gathering the evidence he needed to change Richmond Industries from the inside out. The corporate ID badge pressed against his chest like a promise waiting to be kept. The thermos felt different in Harold's hands tonight, warmer somehow, more purposeful. He'd taken extra care with the soup, adding a handful of Mary's special seasoning saved for holidays. The worn metal container had been their constant companion, through years of picnics, overtime shifts, and hospital stays. Now it served a new purpose, bridging the gap between two strangers on a snowy Christmas Eve. "Merry Christmas, Michael," Harold said softly, approaching the gate. It was the first time he'd addressed his silent guest directly. Something about the day, about everything that had happened, made the usual quiet exchange feel insufficient. Michael looked up, surprise flickering briefly across his features. His eyes, Harold noticed, were keen and intelligent despite his disheveled appearance. There was a dignity in his posture that seemed at odds with his circumstances. "I added some extra vegetables today," Harold continued, unscrewing the thermos cap to pour the steaming soup. "And there's bread, Mary's recipe. She always said holidays were for sharing, no matter what we had or didn't have." Michael accepted the soup with his usual careful nod, but this time he spoke, his voice surprisingly cultured. "Your wife?" Harold paused, touched by this break in their practiced silence. "Yes. She passed 3 years ago. Cancer." He smiled, gently. "She would have insisted you come inside on a night like this. But you don't." It wasn't a question. "No," Harold agreed. "I respect that some people need their distance, their dignity." He looked out at the falling snow. "Sometimes kindness means letting people accept help on their own terms." Steam rose from the soup cup, carrying the aroma of vegetables and herbs into the cold air. Michael took a careful sip, and something like recognition crossed his face. "This is different from usual," he observed. Harold nodded. "Christmas Eve tradition, Mary's special recipe." He hesitated, then added, "Might be the last time for a while. Lost my job today. 40 years at Richmond Industries ended with a manila envelope and a security escort." Michael's hand tightened slightly around the cup. "I'm sorry. Funny thing is," Harold continued, surprising himself with his openness, "I'm not angry. Disappointed, yes. Worried about the future, certainly. But mostly I'm sad for the company. They're losing something they don't even know they have." "What's that?" "Heart," connection, the understanding that business is about people, not just profits. Harold brushed snow from his sleeve. My father-in-law used to say that money is just numbers on paper, but relationships are the real currency of life. Michael was silent for a long moment, sipping the soup thoughtfully. When he spoke again, his voice carried an odd note of tension. What will you do now? Keep going. Keep doing what I can. Harold gestured to the thermos. This, for instance. Maybe I can't afford as much, but there's always something to share. He smiled slightly. Mary would accept nothing less. The snow fell more heavily now, creating a quiet curtain around them. In the distance, church bells began to ring, marking the hour. You're a surprising man, Harold Matthews, Michael said quietly. No, just someone who's learned what matters. Harold took the empty cup, refilling it from the thermos. My last day at work, I left my gold watch on the desk, 40 years of service wrapped up in a piece of metal. But this, he held up the thermos. This was Mary's. Some things are worth more than gold. They stood in companionable silence as Michael finished the second cup of soup. The Christmas lights from neighboring houses cast colorful shadows on the snow, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Thank you, Michael said finally, handing back the cup. Not just for tonight. For every night. Harold secured the cup to the thermos. Thank you for letting me help. It's meant more than you know. He turned to go, then paused. Whatever brought you here, Michael, I hope you find what you're looking for. As Harold walked back to his house, he didn't see the way Michael watched him, didn't notice the conflict evident in the other man's face. Behind him, the silent figure sat straighter, one hand moving to the inner pocket of his coat, fingers brushing against a hidden ID badge as a decision slowly crystallized in his mind. Later that night, in his private office across town, Robert McAllister spread Harold's performance reviews across his desk. 40 years of exemplary evaluations, each one telling a story the efficiency consultants had missed entirely. 1983. Matthews shows exceptional attention to detail and a natural ability to build relationships with clients and colleagues alike. 1992, Employee of the Year for outstanding contribution to company culture and client satisfaction. 2005, Matthews' mentoring program has resulted in the highest retention rate in department history. 2015, demonstrated extraordinary leadership. During difficult quarter, maintaining team morale while exceeding targets. The most recent review from just 6 months ago was equally glowing. Continues to be the backbone of the department, though some resistance to new automated systems. Noted, Robert pulled up the efficiency consultant's report on his laptop, anger growing as he read their clinical assessment. Position identified as legacy overhead. Automated solutions available. Recommend immediate termination to reduce costs before fiscal year end. They'd completely missed the human element. Robert opened another file, a spreadsheet tracking departmental performance over the past decade. Harold's section consistently showed the lowest turnover rate, highest client retention, and strongest employee satisfaction scores. His executive assistant had compiled interviews with Harold's colleagues, conducted discreetly over the past week. The stories painted a picture no efficiency report could capture. When my mother was sick, Harold covered my shifts without being asked. He taught me everything I know about client relations. The Christmas food drive was his idea. It's helped hundreds of families over the years. Harold's the one who suggested the college scholarship program for employees' children. Robert picked up his father's old journal, turning to an entry from 1985. Matthews understands what so many forget, that business is built on trust, not just transactions. He's the kind of employee you build a company around, not the kind you replace with software. The evidence was overwhelming. The consultant's recommendation, which Robert had approved without proper review, wasn't just cold, it was fundamentally flawed. They'd focused on Harold's salary and age, while ignoring the invaluable institutional knowledge and human connections that walked out the door with him. Robert's phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. Security footage from today's termination. Attached. He hesitated before playing it, watching as Harold packed his desk with quiet dignity, left his gold watch behind, helped a crying colleague even in his own moment of crisis. The next message contained clips from previous months. Harold arriving early, staying late, teaching new employees, organizing birthday celebrations, maintaining the human touch that kept Richmond Industries from becoming just another soulless corporation. Robert closed his laptop, moving to the window. The same snow that fell on Harold's modest home now dusted the manicured grounds of corporate headquarters. Somewhere between these two worlds lay the soul of the company his father had built. The quarterly projection sat unopened on his desk, next to the efficiency consultant's invoice. Their recommendations had promised to increase profitability by 3.2% through staff reductions and automation. But watching Harold these past months had taught Robert to look beyond the numbers. He pulled out his phone, typing a message to his assistant. Cancel all automation implementation plans, schedule full review of recent terminations, and find out everything you can about the employee assistance programs Harold Matthews has created. Over the years, another text arrived, a photo from the company's digital archives. It showed a much younger Harold Matthews standing beside Robert's father at the opening of the company's first community outreach center. Both men were smiling, sharing a vision of business as a force for positive change. Robert looked at his own reflection in the window, superimposed over the snowy scene below. Tomorrow was Christmas. Tomorrow he would take off his disguise and right this wrong. But first, he had to understand exactly what his company had lost today. He turned back to the performance reviews, determined to spend the night learning everything he could about the man who had shown him what leadership really meant. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight sparkling off fresh snow. Harold was already awake, preparing his morning coffee when he heard an unexpected knock at the door. Through the front window, he could see Michael standing on his porch. But something was different. The shabby clothes were gone, replaced by an impeccable wool coat. His posture had changed, too, carrying an air of authority that seemed both familiar and out of place. Harold opened the door slowly, coffee cup still, in hand. "Michael?" "Mr. Matthews," the man said, reaching into his coat pocket. "I believe it's time I properly introduced myself." He pulled out a business card, crisp, elegant, bearing the Richmond Industries logo. "I'm Robert McAllister." The coffee cup trembled slightly in Harold's hand. "CEO Robert McAllister. May I come in? I think we have much to discuss." Harold stepped back automatically, years of ingrained politeness overriding his shock. Robert, no longer Michael, entered, looking around, the modest home with keen interest. His eyes lingered on the family photos, the Christmas cards displayed on the mantel, the well-worn furniture that spoke of a life lived with care rather than luxury. "Your soup was excellent last night," Robert said quietly. "Your wife's recipe." "You said?" Harold set his coffee cup down carefully, steadying himself against the surreal nature of the moment. "Why?" Robert pulled out another item, his corporate ID badge. "Because I needed to understand. The consultants gave me numbers, statistics, recommendations, but they couldn't show me the heart of Richmond Industries." He gestured to the kitchen. "Perhaps we could sit? This may take some time." In the kitchen, morning light streamed through Mary's lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the table where they sat. The business card lay between them like a bridge between two worlds. 3 months ago," Robert began, "I was about to approve a company-wide restructuring plan. Automation, staff reductions, streamlining, all the buzzwords consultants love. Your name was on the list, flagged for immediate termination." He paused. "But I remembered something my father used to say about you." "Your father was a good man," Harold said softly. "He understood what business was really about." Yes, he did, and I'd forgotten that. So I decided to see for myself what the consultants were telling me to throw away. Robert smiled slightly. I chose your street because I knew you arrived early, left late. I wanted to observe the kind of employee they said was obsolete. Harold looked at the business card, then back at Robert. And what did you learn? I learned that efficiency reports don't measure the value of someone who knows every employee's children's names. That productivity metrics can't quantify the impact of a mentor who stays late to help new hires succeed. Robert leaned forward. I learned that my father was right about you, Mr. Matthews. You're not just an employee. You're the conscience of Richmond Industries. Was, Harold corrected gently. Past tense. No. Robert placed a folder on the table. Present tense, if you're willing. I spent last night reviewing your personnel file, your initiatives, your impact on the company. The termination was a mistake, my mistake, but it's one I intend to correct. Harold's hand moved to the empty spot on his wrist where his watch had been. With all due respect, Mr. McAllister, I'm not interested in charity. This isn't charity, Mr. Matthews. It's an investment in Richmond Industries' future. Robert opened the folder. I'm offering you a new position, Director of Corporate, Culture and Employee Relations. Full benefits, significant raise, and most importantly, real authority to implement the human-focused programs you've been quietly running for years. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of Mary's old clock. Through the window, children could be seen playing in the fresh snow, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. Why me? Harold asked finally. Why not someone younger, more efficiently minded? Robert gestured to the thermos on the counter. Because when you lost everything, your first thought was still to help others. That's the kind of leadership Richmond Industries needs. Not just numbers and systems, but heart and wisdom, he smiled. Besides, I've tasted your soup. Anyone who can make a meal that good in a stranger's honor is someone worth keeping around. Harold looked at Mary's photo on the wall, almost hearing her voice. Sometimes the best gifts come in unexpected packages. The business card caught the morning light, the Richmond Industries logo gleaming like a promise of new beginnings. Harold pulled out the company financial reports Robert had brought, pages of numbers that told only part of the story. These efficiency metrics, he said, pointing to a highlighted section, they're not wrong exactly, but they're incomplete. Robert nodded, warming his hands around the coffee cup Harold had provided. The kitchen felt different now, the morning light illuminating two men, bridging a gap between corporate policy and human reality. Show me what they're missing, Robert said. Harold pulled a worn notebook from his cardboard box of office belongings. Take the Peterson account. Your consultants noted it requires 30% more man-hours than our automated systems would. What they didn't calculate was the personal relationships that kept Peterson with us through 3 competing offers. He opened the notebook, revealing meticulous notes about clients' families, preferences, concerns. Tom Peterson's daughter is starting college next fall. He mentioned being worried about tuition during our October review. I connected him with our Employee Education Assistance Program, the one your father helped establish. Now Peterson's considering moving his entire corporate portfolio to us. Robert studied the notebook. You keep records of everything? People matter, Mr. McAllister. Their stories matter. When Mary was sick, your father made sure our insurance covered experimental treatments. That's why she had 3 more years with us. Harold's voice softened. Corporate kindness isn't weakness. It's an investment that pays dividends in loyalty and trust. The consultant said personal relationships aren't scalable, Robert admitted. Maybe not entirely, but they're sustainable. Look at the turnover rates in my department. Harold pulled out another report. 15% lower than company average. Every employee we keep is institutional knowledge we don't lose, training costs we don't incur. Robert leaned back. Considering, you're talking about a fundamentally different approach to corporate management. I'm talking about balance. Yes, we need efficiency. Yes, technology has its place, but not at the expense of human connection. Harold gestured to the financial reports. These numbers, they measure quarterly profits. But what about the long-term cost of losing employee loyalty, community trust, the intangible assets that built Richmond Industries? Standing, Harold retrieved Mary's recipe book from the counter. Take this soup recipe. I could program it into a machine, get perfect measurements every time. But would it carry the same meaning, the same care? Some things can't be automated. Robert picked up the financial reports, then set them aside. Tell me about your vision, Mr. Matthews. If you had the authority to reshape our corporate culture, where would you start? With people. Always with people. Harold opened his notebook again. Linda in accounting. Brilliant with numbers, but she's considering leaving because our current policies don't accommodate her son's special needs. James in data entry. He's developed an informal mentoring system that's improved department accuracy by 20%. Tom in maintenance. He knows more about our building systems than any manual, he continued, passion growing in his voice. These aren't just employees, Mr. McAllister. They're the foundation of something greater. Your father understood that. Richmond Industries wasn't built by algorithms. It was built by people who believed they were part of something meaningful. Robert studied Harold's face, seeing the same conviction he'd witnessed night after night from his post by the gate. The board won't be easily convinced. Then let's show them, not just tell them, show them. Harold sketched quickly in his notebook. Start small. Pilot program in my old department. Measure everything, not just efficiency metrics, but employee satisfaction, client retention, community impact. Give me 6 months to prove that humanity and profitability aren't mutually exclusive. The morning had grown brighter, sunlight dancing off the snow outside. In the distance, church bells rang, celebrating Christmas Day. 2 men sat in a modest kitchen, reimagining the future of a company that had lost its way. 6 months, Robert said finally, starting January 1st. But I want weekly reports. Both kinds. Numbers and stories. Harold nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. Thank you for seeing what the consultants missed. Thank you for showing me what I'd forgotten. Robert stood, straightening his coat. Merry Christmas, Mr. Matthews. Merry Christmas, Mr. McAllister. Harold paused. And thank you for accepting my soup all those nights. It meant more than you know. It meant everything, Robert said quietly. It showed me exactly what we've been throwing away. Robert placed a draft contract on Harold's kitchen table, its crisp pages a stark contrast to the homey surroundings. I had my assistant prepare this last night. Take your time reviewing it. Harold adjusted his reading glasses, studying the document carefully. Director of Corporate Culture and Employee Relations, he read aloud. Reporting directly to the CEO. With full autonomy to implement your vision, Robert added, and a seat on the executive committee. The contract outlined a transformation more comprehensive than Harold had imagined. Employee wellness programs, mentorship initiatives, community outreach, all the ideas he'd championed over the years, now given official sanction and substantial funding. This is generous, Harold said carefully. It's necessary. Robert pulled out his phone, showing Harold a graph. Employee satisfaction across all departments has dropped 30% since we started implementing the automation initiatives. Client retention is following the same trend. Harold nodded, remembering conversations overheard in break rooms, the growing tension in quarterly meetings. People feel replaceable. Exactly. We've created a culture of fear, not innovation. Robert leaned forward. That's why this position is crucial. You won't just be managing programs, you'll be rebuilding trust. The contract included specific goals, reducing turnover by 20% in the first year, establishing mentorship programs in every department, creating clear career development paths for all employees. But it was the final clause that caught Harold's attention. The Richmond Industries Legacy Program, he read. What's this? Robert smiled. Your first major initiative, if you accept. a comprehensive approach to preserving and transmitting institutional knowledge. He pulled out another document, a rough outline Harold recognized from his own notebook. Based on your informal system of tracking relationships and connections, the program would pair experienced employees with newcomers, not just for technical training, but for cultural orientation. It would document the unwritten knowledge that kept departments running smoothly, the kind of wisdom that couldn't be captured in procedural manuals. You've been watching closely, Harold observed. I had to understand what we were about to lose. Robert gestured to the contract. This isn't just about keeping you, Mr. Matthews. It's about learning from you, about building your approach into the very structure of Richmond Industries. Harold stood, walking to the window. Outside, the Christmas morning sun illuminated his small garden where Mary had spent so many happy hours. She would have appreciated the irony, how his greatest professional opportunity came disguised as a crisis delivered by a CEO pretending to be homeless. There will be resistance, he said finally. Change always faces opposition. I'm counting on it. Robert's voice held a note of determination. Opposition means engagement. It means people care enough to argue, to defend their perspectives. That's exactly what we need, real dialogue about the company's future. Harold returned to the table, picking up the contract again. The salary figure made him blink, but it was the scope of authority that truly mattered. This wasn't a ceremonial position or a gesture of charity. This was a mandate for genuine change. I'll need a team, he said. People who understand both the human and business aspects. Choose them yourself, full discretion. And the automation initiatives? Suspended, pending review. We'll look for ways to enhance human capabilities, not replace them. Harold thought of Linda, James, Tom, all the employees, whose potential had been overshadowed by efficiency metrics. I want to start with the recently terminated positions, review each case, understand what we're really losing. Already in progress, Robert confirmed. My assistant has the files ready. A moment of understanding passed between them. Robert hadn't just been observing these past months. He'd been preparing for this transformation, gathering evidence, building a case for a different kind of corporate future. Harold picked up his pen, Mary's old fountain pen, the one she'd given him on their first anniversary. Before I sign, Mr. McAllister, I need one assurance. Name it. This isn't about me. This is about making Richmond Industries what your father always meant it to be. A force for positive change in people's lives. If we're going to do this, we do it right. No half measures. Robert stood, extending his hand. On my father's memory, Mr. Matthews, we do it right. The contract lay between them, more than just a job offer, a bridge between old values and new possibilities, between corporate efficiency and human dignity. Harold uncapped the pen, Mary's voice clear in his memory. Sometimes, love, the biggest dreams come wrapped in the humblest packages. The morning newspaper lay on Harold's kitchen table, its headlines about Richmond Industries' recent modernization efforts already outdated. Robert had made several calls, setting things in motion even on Christmas morning. The company's direction was about to change dramatically. The press release goes out tomorrow, Robert said, checking his phone. My team's working on it now. Richmond Industries announces new direction in corporate leadership. Harold poured fresh coffee for them both. Christmas Day preparations. Mary would appreciate the symbolism. Speaking of which, Robert reached into his briefcase, pulling out a familiar object. I believe this belongs to you. Harold's gold watch gleamed in the morning light. I left this as a message. And I received it. But now it represents something new. Not just 40 years of past service, but the future we're building. Robert smiled. Though I admit watching you check the time on the kitchen clock these past few days was rather poignant. As if on cue, the clock chimed 10. Harold accepted the watch, its weight familiar and somehow different. We should call Linda first, he said, slipping it onto his wrist. Her son's medical treatment's already done. I had HR revise our healthcare policies this morning, backdated to include any gaps in coverage. Robert's efficiency now served a different purpose. She'll have a message waiting when she checks her email. Harold nodded approvingly. James in data entry next. His mentoring program will become the template for company-wide implementation. Robert made a note. We'll need his insight on scaling it effectively. They worked through the morning, the kitchen table becoming a command center for corporate transformation. Harold's notebook filled with names, ideas, connections, the human web he'd maintained for years now becoming official policy. Tom in maintenance, Harold said, checking his list. His knowledge of the building systems is worth 10 consulting firms, Robert finished. I watched him talk a junior technician through an emergency repair last month, the kind of teaching you can't automate. Outside, carolers passed by, their songs drifting through the window. Harold paused, listening. Your father loved Christmas. He remembered, said it was when you could best see the true heart of people. He was right. Robert set down his phone. That's what these past 3 months taught me. Watching you maintain your daily act of kindness, even after losing everything. It showed me what real leadership looks like. Harold's hand went to the watch. Leadership is service, he used to say. A lesson I had to relearn. Robert stood, moving to the window. You know what struck me most? How you never asked my name, never demanded my story. You just helped. Everyone has their reasons for needing help, Harold said simply. It's not my place to judge, only to offer what I can. The morning had warmed, snow beginning to melt in the strengthening sun. Change was coming, not just to Richmond Industries, but to the understanding of what business could be. We should document this, Robert said suddenly. The whole journey, from that first bowl of soup to this moment. It's more than a corporate turnaround story. It's a template for human-centered business. Harold thought of Mary's recipe book, its margins filled with notes about more than just ingredients. Stories teach better than mandates, he agreed. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, his daughter. Merry Christmas, Dad. Still coming for dinner? Harold looked at Robert. Would you join us? Sarah would love to hear how her father's soup changed corporate policy. I'd be honored. Robert glanced at his own phone. Though I should warn you, once the press release goes out tomorrow, your quiet life might get a bit more attention. As long as it serves a purpose. Harold began gathering the papers scattered across the table. Your father once told me that every business decision should be able to pass the Christmas morning test. What's that? If you can look in the mirror on Christmas morning and feel proud of your choices, you're doing something right. Harold smiled. I think he'd be proud of today's decisions. The newspaper headlines would change tomorrow. The stock market would react. Analysts would speculate. Competitors would take notice. But here, in this modest kitchen, 2 men had rediscovered an essential truth, that business, at its best, was about more than profit. It was about people, purpose, and the simple power of human kindness. The new office key felt different in Harold's hand as he approached Richmond Industries the next morning. No longer the simple brass of a mid-level manager, but the electronic fob of an executive, granting access to the entire building. Yet he deliberately arrived at his usual early hour, nodding to Carl at security. Mr. Matthews, Carl stood confused. I thought we heard, a lot can change in a day, Carl. Harold smiled warmly. How's Amy's college application process going? She got into her first choice yesterday. I was going to tell you. But wonderful news. We should discuss the scholarship program later. There have been some updates to the policy. The lobby held a strange energy. Word of yesterday's terminations mixing with rumors of this morning's press release about new leadership. Harold's familiar face among the early arrivals caused double takes and whispered conversations. He took his usual elevator but pressed a different button. Top floor, executive offices. The doors opened to reveal Linda, already at work despite the holiday break. Harold! She jumped up, tears forming. We all saw the announcement, but is it really true? He hugged her warmly. All true. And your first task in the new year will be helping me redesign our healthcare benefits, starting with your son's coverage." She burst into tears, and Harold was reminded of why he'd always kept tissues in his desk. "Speaking of desks," he said gently, "would you help me find mine? Everything's a bit new up here." Linda led him through the executive floor, past startled, early-arriving managers who didn't quite know how to process the former mid-level employee, now bearing a director's badge. They reached a corner office with a nameplate still warm from the printer. "Harold Matthews, Director of Corporate Culture and Employee Relations." "Mr. McAllister had it rushed," Linda explained. "He said you'd prefer a view of the employee." In parking lot over the executive garage, Harold set down his briefcase, the same worn leather one he'd carried for 20 years. The office was larger than his old one, with windows on two sides, but it felt empty without the family photos and accumulated memories. A knock at the door revealed James from data entry, clutching a folder. "Sir, Mr. Matthews, I heard you were back. I've been working on that mentoring program outline you encouraged, and I thought maybe—" "Perfect timing, James. Come in. Linda, would you join us? I think it's time we made this official." As they settled around the conference table in his office, Harold noticed more familiar faces gathering in the hallway. Tom from maintenance, Sarah from accounting, people he'd mentored, helped, supported over the years. Robert appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with satisfaction. "I see you're already building your team." "Not building," Harold corrected. "Recognizing. The team was always here. We just needed to acknowledge it." The morning unfolded in a blur of meetings, but unlike the corporate sessions Harold had attended before, these felt different. They talked about people first, numbers second. Each decision was weighed not just for its financial impact, but for its effect on employees, families, community. By lunchtime, Harold's old desk plant had appeared in his new office, along with his collection of family photos. Someone, he suspected Linda, had retrieved them from his old desk. The golden watch on his wrist kept time as he worked, but now it measured progress forward instead of counting down to retirement. "Your father would have loved this," Harold told Robert during a brief break. "He always said the view from the atop shouldn't make you forget what's happening on the ground." Robert nodded, watching the growing crowd of employees gathering outside Harold's office, each waiting to share ideas they'd never dared voice before. "We're going to need a bigger conference room. We're going to need a bigger vision," Harold corrected, reaching for his notebook. "But first, we need to listen, really listen." He opened his door wider, inviting in the next group of employees. The key card on his desk caught the winter sunlight, no longer just a tool for entering a building, but a symbol of opening new doors for others. The day ahead would be long, the challenges significant, but as Harold looked at the eager faces around his conference table, he knew that this mixture of experience and innovation, of corporate power and human connection, was exactly what Richmond Industries needed to thrive. The Employee Welfare Program document sat before the Board of Directors, its comprehensive scope making several members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Harold stood at the head of the conference table, his presentation reflecting weeks of careful preparation. "What you're proposing," Elizabeth Chen, the CFO, said carefully, "would represent a significant shift in corporate resource allocation." "Yes," Harold agreed, "but let me show you the returns on that investment." He clicked to the next slide, revealing data from his pilot program. In just 3 weeks, employee satisfaction in the test departments has increased by 40%. Productivity is up 23%. Sick day usage has dropped by 30%. Robert, sitting at the other end of the table, watched the board members' reactions. Some looked skeptical, others intrigued. Harold continued, his quiet confidence filling the room, but numbers tell only part of the story. He distributed a folder to each board member. "These are letters from employees and their families. Real stories about how our initial changes have already impacted lives." The board members began reading. Harold had carefully selected the testimonials. Linda's son receiving his needed medical treatment, James's mentoring program producing. Measurable results. Tom's facilities team achieving record efficiency through improved morale. This isn't just about being nice, Harold emphasized. It's about building a sustainable, resilient organization. When we invest in our people, they invest in us. Margaret Wilson, the longest-serving board member, looked up from the letters. This reminds me of how Robert Sr. used to run things, she said softly, before we got caught up in quarterly metrics. Harold nodded, because he understood something we've forgotten, that business is ultimately about people serving people. He clicked to the next slide, revealing the comprehensive structure of the employee welfare program. It wasn't just about benefits and perks. It was a complete reimagining of corporate culture. Mentorship at all levels, he explained. Career. Development paths that value both technical and human skills. A healthcare program that recognizes family needs. Community engagement initiatives that give our employees purpose beyond profit. The cost projections made several board members wince, but Harold was ready. Now look at the projected savings. Another slide. Reduced turnover, lower training costs, decreased healthcare claims through preventive care, improved client retention, through stronger relationships. Robert spoke for the first time. I've witnessed this approach firsthand. It works. The question isn't whether we can afford to implement these changes. It's whether we can afford not to. Harold moved to his final slide, a simple photo of the Richmond Industries lobby taken that morning. Employees chatting, helping each other, engaging in the small moments of connection that built strong teams. This is our real assets page, he said quietly. Not the numbers on our balance sheet, but the people who make those numbers possible. The boardroom fell silent as the presentation ended. Harold remained standing, patient, ready for questions. He'd learned long ago that real change required both conviction and patience. Elizabeth Chen spoke first. The healthcare expansions alone would cost less than our current turnover rate, Harold finished. I've included the calculations in Appendix B. One by one, the board members raised concerns, and one by one, Harold addressed them with a mixture of hard data and human insight. His 40 years of experience gave him a unique perspective. He could speak both the language of business and the language of people. Finally, Margaret Wilson closed her folder. Robert Sr. would have loved this, she said. He always said we were in the people business, just expressed through commerce. The vote was called. Harold stood quietly as hands were raised. Robert watched from his end of the table, a small smile playing at his lips. Motion carries, the board secretary announced. The employee welfare program is approved for immediate implementation. Harold gathered his materials, but Robert stopped him before he could leave. Well done, he said softly, though I suspect the real work is just beginning. It always was, Harold replied. The program is just a framework. The real change happens in daily interactions, small kindnesses, moments of understanding. Like soup on a cold night? Robert asked with a knowing smile. Exactly like that. Harold tucked the program document under his arm. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the maintenance team. Tom has some ideas about improving workspace ergonomics. As he left the boardroom, Harold could feel the shift beginning, not just in policy, but in possibility. The employee welfare program wasn't just a document, it was a declaration of values, a return to principles that should never have been forgotten. The stack of thank you letters grew daily on Harold's desk, each one telling a story of lives changed by Richmond Industries' new direction. They came not just from employees, but from their families, local businesses, and even competitors curious about the company's transformation. Another article about us, Linda said, placing the morning paper on Harold's desk. The headline read, Richmond Industries leads corporate culture revolution. Profits rise as human-first policies take effect. Harold picked up one of the letters, this one from Amy, Carl's daughter, thanking him for the expanded scholarship program that had made her college dreams possible. These matter more than the headlines, he said quietly. The phone rang. Another. Reporter, wanting to understand how Richmond Industries had increased productivity while other companies struggled with post-holiday turnover. Harold's explanation was always the same. We invested in people, and people invested in us. Down in the lobby, the changes were visible. The security desk, once a symbol of corporate barrier, had become an information hub. Carl and his team knew everyone by name, celebrated their achievements, supported them through challenges. It was exactly the kind of cultural shift Harold had envisioned. "Mr. Matthews?" Tom appeared in the doorway. "The facilities team wanted you to see this." He handed over architectural plans for the building's renovation. The sterile break rooms were being transformed into community spaces with comfortable seating and areas for collaboration. "The teams designed it themselves," Tom explained proudly. "Everyone contributed ideas." Harold studied the plans, noting how they balanced efficiency with humanity. "Perfect. When can we start?" "That's the thing, sir. We already have." The employees volunteered their weekend time, said they wanted to build the change they believed in. Through his office window, Harold could see a group of local business owners touring the building. Robert had initiated an outreach program, sharing their successful practices with other companies. "A rising tide lifts all boats," he'd said, quoting his father. The initiative was spreading beyond Richmond Industries. Other corporations had begun reaching out, asking about their employee welfare programs. Harold's inbox was filled with requests for consultation, speaking engagements, partnership opportunities. But it was the smaller changes that moved him most. Linda's son receiving successful treatment under the new healthcare plan. James's mentoring program becoming a model for industry-wide implementation. The maintenance team's ideas being sought after by architectural firms. A knock at his door revealed Sarah from accounting, holding yet another letter. "This one's different," she said softly. "It's from the homeless shelter downtown." Harold opened it carefully. The shelter reported a surprising trend. Several of their regular clients had found employment through Richmond Industries' new community outreach program. The cycle of kindness that had begun with a simple bowl of soup was widening, touching more lives. Robert joined him later that afternoon, watching the sunset paint the city skyline. "The board just received the first quarter results," he said. "Profits up 17%, employee turnover down to historic lows, client satisfaction at record highs." "And the human metrics?" Harold asked. "Even better. Healthcare costs dropping due to preventive care, community engagement hours tripling, employee-initiated innovations up by 200%. Robert smiled. "Turns out, when people feel valued, they create value." Harold picked up a recent thank you letter, this one from a competitor's CEO, acknowledging how Richmond's example had inspired them to re-evaluate their own corporate culture. "Your father always said business had the power to transform society. One decision at a time," Robert agreed. "One act of kindness at a time." Through the window, they could see employees leaving for the day, but many were gathering in the new community spaces, sharing ideas, supporting each other, building something larger than themselves. The thank you letters continued to arrive, each one a testament to the truth Harold had always known, that success in business, as in life, came not from treating people as resources to be optimized, but as humans to be valued, supported, and empowered. The annual report lay open on the conference table, its pages telling a story beyond mere numbers. "Richmond Industries, a year of human-centered growth," read the cover, featuring a photo of employees volunteering at the local homeless shelter, where it had all begun. Harold sat with Robert, reviewing the document that would soon be shared with shareholders. But this wasn't a typical corporate report. Alongside the financial metrics were measures of human impact, community engagement, and social return on investment. "Page 1, Robert said proudly. "Employee retention up 85%, healthcare costs down 30% through preventive care programs, client satisfaction at 98%. Harold turned to the next section. "Community impact. Metrics. The scholarship program had sent 15 employees' children to college. The mentorship initiative had trained over 200 new leaders. The expanded healthcare program had supported 38 families through major medical challenges. Remember when the consultant said these programs would drain our resources? Robert smiled, pointing to the bottom line. Profits up 23% year over year. Turns out, doing good is good business. The report included personal stories alongside the statistics. Linda's son had completed his treatment successfully and was now interning in the IT department. James's mentoring program had become a case study at 3 business schools. Tom's facilities team had won an innovation award for their employee-designed workspace solutions. But this is my favorite part, Harold said, turning to a special section titled The Soup Kitchen Initiative. The company's new program, inspired by his own evening ritual, had served over 10,000 meals to the homeless while creating job training opportunities and employment pathways. Your simple act of kindness became a corporate movement, Robert observed. We've hired 30 people through that program alone. The financial data told its own story. The efficiency consultant's original projection of 3.2% profit increase through automation had been dwarfed by the actual results achieved. Through human investment, employee-driven innovations had opened new market opportunities. Client loyalty had generated steady growth. The shareholders' meeting next week should be interesting, Robert said. We're not just presenting numbers, we're showcasing a new way of doing business. Harold nodded, remembering the skepticism they'd faced a year ago. Your father would be proud, not just of the results, but of how we achieved them. The report's final section, Looking Forward, outlined ambitious plans for the coming year. Expansion of educational programs, enhancement of family support services, development of new community partnerships. But most significantly, the creation of the Richmond Institute for Human-Centered Business, a think tank dedicated to spreading these practices industry-wide. The consulting firms are still baffled, Robert chuckled. They keep asking for our secret algorithm, our optimization strategy. Should we tell them it's my wife's soup recipe? Harold smiled, but his eyes were serious. The real secret was there all along. Treat people like people, not numbers. Through the conference room windows, they could see the transformed office space below. Gone were the isolating cubicles, replaced by a mix of collaborative areas and quiet zones. Employees moved between departments freely, sharing ideas, supporting each other, building on each other's strengths. The annual report included one more crucial metric: the number of companies that had adopted similar programs after visiting Richmond Industries. 23 firms had already implemented their own versions of the employee welfare program. 15 more were in the planning stages. We're creating a legacy, Robert said quietly, not just for Richmond Industries, but for business itself. Harold touched the report's cover photo, remembering those cold nights sharing soup with a disguised CEO. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows, reminiscent of that fateful Christmas Eve 1 year ago. But now, instead of a single act of kindness in the dark, there was a building full of people, carrying that spirit forward, multiplying it, transforming it into something larger than themselves. Next year's report, Harold said, should include a recipe section. Robert laughed. Soup for corporate success? Why not? After all, the best business lessons often come from the simplest truths, that kindness generates loyalty, that humanity inspires innovation, that treating people well isn't just right, it's revolutionary. The new Christmas tradition document hung framed in the Richmond Industries lobby. Annual community Christmas Eve celebration, where every act of kindness counts. Below it, employees and community members gathered, transforming the corporate space into a warm holiday haven. Harold stood near the entrance, watching as Linda directed volunteers setting up serving stations. The lobby had been redesigned with gathering spaces and comfortable seating areas, but tonight it served a special purpose. A company-wide celebration that doubled as a community outreach program. "Everything ready in the kitchen?" Robert asked, joining him. "Mary's recipe multiplied by 50, Harold smiled, though I had to share the secret ingredients this time. The corporate kitchen had been busy all day, with employees taking turns helping prepare the massive quantity of soup that had inspired this new tradition. The aroma filled the building, drawing people in from the cold December evening. "First, guests arriving," Linda called out. Through the doors came a mix of employees, their families and community members, including several former homeless individuals who now worked for Richmond Industries through the Soup Kitchen initiative. Harold watched as Tom from maintenance welcomed a group of shelter residents, showing them to comfortable seats. James was teaching his mentees how to serve soup with dignity and warmth. Sarah from accounting had brought her entire extended family to volunteer. "Remember last Christmas Eve?" Robert asked quietly. "You serving soup, me pretending to be homeless? Both of us learning what really matters." Harold nodded, "though I suspect you got colder than I did." The lobby filled with conversation and laughter. Children of employees played together while their parents shared stories and soup. New hires chatted with senior executives. Community members mingled with corporate leaders. All the artificial barriers dissolved in the warmth of shared purpose. "Mr. Matthews?" A young woman approached, wearing a Richmond Industries employee badge. "I was one of the first people hired through the Soup Kitchen initiative. I wanted you to know I'm starting college next month, thanks to the education program." Harold recognized her from the shelter. "How's your mother doing?" "Much better. The company healthcare plan." She hugged him suddenly, then hurried away to help serve soup. Robert watched the interaction with satisfaction. "You've created something remarkable here, Harold. This isn't just a Christmas party. It's a demonstration of what business can be." Through the windows, snow began to fall, just as it had 1 year ago. But now, instead of a solitary act of kindness in the darkness, there was a building full of light and hope, of connections being forged and strengthened. Linda approached with 2 bowls of soup. "Made it myself, following Mary's recipe." She handed them to Harold and Robert, "Though it's still not quite as good as yours, Harold." "That's because you forgot the secret ingredient," Harold said, tasting it. "Hope. Mary always said hope was what made her soup special." Around them, the celebration continued to grow. Employees who hadn't planned to attend dropped by after seeing the lights and hearing the laughter. Community members who'd been hesitant felt welcomed and valued. Children ran through the lobby, playing games organized by the HR team. "Next year," Robert said, "we'll need a bigger space. Or maybe," Harold suggested, "we'll inspire other companies to host their own celebrations. Imagine every corporate lobby in the city transformed into a community gathering place." The framed tradition document caught the light, its simple words carrying the weight of transformed lives and renewed purpose. What had begun as one man's quiet act of kindness had grown into a movement, proving that business success and human compassion could not only coexist but flourish together. As the evening deepened, Harold found himself by the front door, watching the snow fall. A year ago, he'd stood in his kitchen, wondering about his future. Now he stood in the heart of a transformed company, surrounded by the proof that kindness multiplied was kindness magnified. "Merry Christmas, Mary," he whispered to the quiet night. "Your soup changed more than just lives. It changed the very meaning of success." Behind him, the celebration continued, a living testament to the power of human-centered business and the endless possibilities that open up when compassion meets commerce.